QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021, Banking and Company Sections and Shortcuts. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars company file. We currently have the home page open. You can open the home page by going to the company dropdown, selecting home page. We also have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the view dropdown, selecting the open windows list, and seeing whether you have this little collapse icon or caret, collapsed or uncollapsed, if you want to see or not see the open windows. In prior presentations, we take a look at the major flows, the most flows with kind of like the most activities within them, that being the vendor flow and the customer flows, or the payables flow, and the revenues flow, or the bills flow, the outflows typically for cash, and the receivables flow or inflows flow at some point, revenue flow for the customer side of things. So now in future presentation, we'll get on to the employees section. Right now, we're going to be concentrating on those other section, company and banking, and then we'll take a look at some of the items over here on this left-hand side as well to see what QuickBooks has added in those areas. Now note that you can customize these. We'll talk a little bit about that in a future presentation, but remember, the homepage in and of itself, it's kind of like a crutch. It's kind of like something that's giving you a visual, pictorial presentation. Once you really understand the homepage, you're probably going to be going to these icons using a different format. It's still nice I still use the homepage sometimes, but you can get to all these items by going to a different format using basically the drop-down items. So you can customize basically the look of the flowchart, but typically it'll also be customized when you set up the company file, setting up the company file to be such as using inventory or having a service company. The homepage will then look a little bit different depending on how you're going to be setting things up or what company file you have chosen or what type of industry you have chosen when setting up the company file. We'll talk more about that when we set up the new company file. The items to the right are items that don't really fit in the flowchart here in the company section and the banking section, but they're those that QuickBooks thinks are going to be important enough to basically put on the home page. So that includes things like a chart of accounts. We'll get into the chart of accounts shortly. That's really one of the setup process that you're going to want to look at. So we'll take a look at that in and of itself in a future presentation. But just note, obviously, it's a very important thing because it's going to be involved in every transaction. All of these transactions will have some accounts that will be affected, as we've seen on the financial statements. We're going to have to set up the chart of accounts. That's typically done at the beginning of the process when you set up the company, and then you would need to add chart accounts to the chart of accounts as you go as necessary. So that will become much more apparent. We'll look at it individually in its own presentation, and then we'll take a look at it as we create a new company file. We have the inventory. So this would be specific to whether you are tracking inventory. They would put this icon in here, and you can put the adjustments to the inventory items here. Items and services. This is another list type item, and this is another term we'll talk about more later, but just know that lists in QuickBooks has a particular term that's not really in accounting. The terminology for accounting, you have to learn accounting terminology, recall, and then you're also going to have to be learning QuickBooks terminology. There's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of differences as well. And lists, especially in the desktop version, takes on its own kind of meaning because under the lists dropdown, we have the major lists. So that means that everything under this dropdown has started to be called basically lists. Item lists are going to be those things that we're going to be using. Mainly, you want to think of them as inventory and service items, helping you to populate some of your data input forms. So that's going to help you to populate your invoices and sales receipts. Again, that's another area that's kind of a setup process, really integral, important part, but it's usually something that you want to have set up before you do basically the data input stuff. We'll talk more about that in its own presentation later. Order checks and forms. So obviously QuickBooks is going to have this item here. This is kind of like an add-on thing. If you want to order more checks and forms, then you can select this and add to that. Then of course we have the calendar. So if you use the calendar within QuickBooks, you can select this item. It can be useful to use the calendar within QuickBooks to basically mark transactions that you need to make, or repetitive transactions, or record memorized types of transactions. And then in the banking section, we have the major component, that being deposits. Notice how they tried to combine these two items. And we had a similar discussion with the checks down here with the vendor section. Remember when we talked about the checks we said, hey, look, why wouldn't the checks be up here in the vendor section? Because usually you're going to be writing a check to a vendor. So you would think that you would have it up here in the vendor section. But you could be writing a check then for other purposes. For example, we might be using the check form to take a withdrawal, taking money out of the company. And so they put it down here in the banking section, even though most of the checks would be going to vendors, and you would think it would be appropriate to be in the vendor section. The deposits is the same type of activity. Hopefully, most of the deposits that we have are coming from customers, and so you would think it would be in the customer section. And they tried to indicate that here with this little arrow, of course, meaning it's the ending process to the customer section. However, you might have deposits for other. You might have taken a loan out. You might have put money into the company. So you could have deposits for things other than money coming from customers. And therefore, they're saying, hey, it doesn't really totally belong in the customer section because not all transactions will be related to the customer cycle. But hopefully most of them will be. And they want to make that nice indication here in the process. But it's over here in the banking section. We've talked about the process of the deposits that would be coming from create sales receipts and receive payments, which would go into undeposited funds and then possibly going into this deposit section that then indicated by this number 2. But we could use the deposit form again to make any other deposits, such as us, the owner, putting money into the company. We would use the same form there. Or in my case, I would actually not use that form unless you were at least as a data input form, unless it was linked to this cycle. But instead, I would go to the check register, enter things into the check register. Remember, as you do so, however, QuickBooks will still generate a deposit form. So even if you use the register, which I think is faster for data input, if it's not linked to these forms, then QuickBooks will still see it as a deposit form. You have the reconcile. The major reconcile we would think is the bank reconciliation. And again, you can get to the bank reconciliation, and we'll see different ways to get to these items as we go through the practice problem. But I just want to note the importance of them, that QuickBooks sees that they're on the homepage. The bank reconciliation is going to be one of the most important type of internal controls that is not just simply the double entry accounting system, the fact that the balance sheet is in balance. So this is really important that you want to be reconciling to your checking account, no matter what system you're using within QuickBooks. You should have the checking account. If you can verify the checking account, because cash is somewhere involved, even if using the accrual method in all major systems, all major flow systems, then if you can verify cash, you're really verifying a lot more than cash. You're verifying basically the whole accounting system to some degree. You're given a huge double check on it. So that reconciliation of cash, really important. That's why we're emphasizing the ease of reconciling with grouping the deposits and whatnot, looking towards that bank reconciliation process, making sure that we do that and make it as easy as possible to do that. Then, of course, we have the check down here, which we discussed. We've got the check register. So we've gone into the check register a few different ways. Again, that's another tool that's really useful to use, to go to the register for those types of checks, those type of transactions, that I would use them if they're not linked to some other transaction. So if I'm putting a check in place and I'm just writing a check or just entering some transaction that's a decrease to the checking account, then I would use the check register rather than a check form, even though QuickBooks will still create a check form because the register is going to be easy to do the data input. Same for the deposits. If they're not linked to something else, I would typically go directly to the register. Print checks. If you're printing checks from QuickBooks, then as you enter the checks, you can assign them to be printed later, and then you can basically print them at one point in time. It's a similar process as we saw when we enter bills and then pay bills. When you pay bills, you can line up all the checks and print them. If you would just simply write the checks and you assign them as to be printed, then you can print them all at one time using this icon. When you print them, you would need to have separate checks from the bank. You'd put them into the printer, and then you can basically print them in order using that feature. And then the enter credit card charges item here to put the adjustments for the credit card. Now on the left-hand side, we have, as we see in the open windows, this is going to be your little view section over here. If you select the drop down, we have the open windows. That's how you open the icon. Just note that you can view this icon a few different ways. So I like the way the default is on the left side of the screen. I use a full screen, however. So if you're using, different setups, you might like different formats of this layout. So you might want this, for example, this side screen on the top. So I could put it on the top here, and then you've got your icons at the top, and maybe this takes up less space for many people. And then you can say view. You can also say you want to hide it, so you can hide it altogether, and then view. And then I'm going to go to the left again. So I like the default, and as we go through it, it'll always be in the default. I have seen people put it here on the top bar. That can be useful. Then you have your shortcuts. They also have these shortcuts. Now, I don't use these shortcuts a lot because, again, just like with the home page, I like the drop downs once I get used to things. So when we go through the practice problem, we'll do a lot of these kind of transactions with the drop down, except for the major flow ones. I still use the home page when I'm looking at the flow to use these major categorizations oftentimes. But notice you can find a lot of the same stuff here in the drop downs, and the drop downs are nice because you can get to the same locations from any screen. I don't need the home screen open to get to them. So the same as to these icons to the left. These are some nice shortcuts, and you might use these, and you could customize these. We'll talk about that in a future presentation. But again, I usually use the drop downs that are pretty quick to me to do. So that's what I typically do. But obviously the home page is the first shortcut item. Then I'll just go through these because, again, these are the things that QuickBooks see as important in some way, shape, or form, which is why they put them into the shortcut. So if we just take a look at them, My Company, this is a nice little area that'll give you the quick rundown of the company information. So you can, the mailing address and your EIN number, and your licensing number and whatnot. I should probably gray that out, but that information can be gotten to nice and quickly in the company area. So I think that's a useful area to have. If you go to the company, next we have the income tracker. This is going to be a similar layout to like the bank feed type of information. We've got the bill tracker, similar side on the bill side of things. We have the calendar, so the calendar's in the shortcut to the left as well. We have the snapshot. This gives you basically a little kind of snapshot overview of where we stand at this point in time. I like to run the reports mainly myself rather than use this snapshot area. I think just going to the reports is the best place to go. But in any case, we have the customers. That's going to be our customer center, same as if we went up top to the customer center. Again, I think that's a pretty quick shortcut to get to this item from the customer center or the home page. So it seems kind of repetitive to have it there to me. Same for the vendors here. Again, that's in the vendors and drop down, and it's on the home page. So it seems somewhat repetitive to have it on the left-hand side. But I think, you can choose whether or not you'd like to have it on the left-hand side or on your top pane here, possibly. And we'll talk about customizing these in a future presentation. These are just what QuickBooks defaults are, which means they think them to be pretty important, right? And then we'll look at the customization. So we have the employees. Again, employees drop down. You can find it here, and it's on the home page. So I think that's a little repetitive. Bank feeds. We'll talk about bank feeds later at the end of the whole practice problem, because I think it's best to learn the flow of things before doing the bank feeds. And then you have documents. So add your first document to QuickBooks. So that's kind of another feature. We might look at that in a few, as an add-on after the whole practice problem type of thing. We got reports. Now the reports, I like to normally go to the reports up here. There's the reports center, or just find them this way. So again, that looks a little repetitive to me, but we'll get into the reports in a future presentation. And I typically won't use the sidebar to get into the reports. Order checks. So if you need to add more checks, then this would be an ordering thing. That would be paying for checks. Add payroll. So they're always going to be adding the payroll here because that's an add-on feature as well. So they're asking you to have the add-on feature. Credit cards, again, credit card information. Services, user licenses. So if you need more people to be using the Intuit system to be logged in at the same time, you can look into the user license information. Again, you might not want that in your shortcut area if you use the shortcuts all the time, because you're not going to be using it all the time. And then you have your feedback information here that, again, it's probably not that useful to you in your day-to-day work. So if you use the shortcuts, you might remove that one. And then down below, you have the My Shortcuts item. You got the view balances. This is a quick look at some balances for the accounts payable, accounts receivable, checking, and so on and so forth. I don't use that quick look that much. I think I just go right to the reports. I think that's the easiest thing to do. So, but maybe that's a snapshot could be useful for some. And then run favorite reports. Again, I don't really use this, but I think it could be useful. I think the quick way to, like, the drop down right here, going to the reports and then going to the drop down is pretty fast, but it still takes a couple steps. The favorite 2 reports is probably the profit and loss and the balance sheet. So maybe it would be a little bit quicker over here if you were to, customize the report and add like the profit and loss maybe, and then add the balance sheet standard, add the balance sheet and say okay. So we just add them. You can remove them here. You can move them up or down on the list. So the lists to the right are the ones that are going to show up in your window to the left. So if I was to do that, that might be a little bit faster, right? I can open this up a little bit more quickly. So that might be worth actually my putting into place, because that's a little bit faster than going here, 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 which we will do the whole time in the course. But still, I think this is pretty fast. So I've never really utilized this, but I might utilize that. And then we have our open windows, which is what we always go to when we start by going to the view drop down open windows list, just to make sure that item is there. You can also, of course, find that down below. That's usually my default area. I always have the open windows open. I'll have it open through the whole time period. And that's another reason I don't really use the favorite reports, or I don't toggle between these items too much, because I'm always down here in the open windows, and I feel like the drop downs are quick enough for me. These items down below are typically going to be add-on items, so you can turn on the payroll by paying QuickBooks and turn on the payroll. We'll talk more about payroll later. Accept credit cards. So if you want to be dealing with the credit cards, again, that's typically an add-on type of feature. In order to accept them, there's going to be some cost to that. Order checks and tax forms. So if you want to be printing the checks out of the system, they got that information out here. And activate T-sheets, which is another supplemental thing that helps you to kind of track the time within the system, if that's going to be something useful to you. So those are going to be the kind of the major items that we want to take a look at, because QuickBooks sees them as the major items. We will get to the payroll in the future. I'm going to go to the company drop-down homepage. We will get to the payroll section in the future. Next time we'll talk a little bit more about customizing, especially this shortcut item, because I think some people could get use from this shortcut item, and we'll think about how to customize that, and then again looking at it from different views, either up top or on the side.